So we are now embarking on the interwar years. The interwar years, for all intents and purposes, are literally a 20-year period. 20-year period running from 1919 to 1939. And the first of the areas that we're going to look at during this period is one of the two areas that got into Czechoslovakia, this one here, called Subcarpathian Rus. This new post-war political order that I have just described, that began to be clarified in 1919, and that had, as we've just seen, divided historic Carpathian Rus, which had been within one state, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, now within three, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania, as you can see on that map. In the green area, approximately 640,000 Carpatho-Rusyns were living there at that time in 1919, 1920. 70% of them, 458,000, found themselves within the borders of Czechoslovakia. So 70%, well over two-thirds. What was this new state of Czechoslovakia? Well, it was formed as a republic. It had a bicameral central parliament in Prague. Some of you on the map put down the city Prague. Well done. Can you imagine I left it out? It's not unimportant in our story. So we'll put it on top of Masaryk. That works, because it's the capital of Czechoslovakia, present-day Czech Republic, and it's in the western part of the country, as you can see on this map here in Bohemia, the old Austrian province of Bohemia. So they have a central parliament, two houses, deputies and senate. Both of them are elected, and a government headed by a president elected for a 7-year term. During this entire period, there were only two presidents who held office in Czechoslovakia. The founder of the republic, this Tomáš Masaryk, who was president elected while he was still in Washington, D.C. in 1918, until he died in 1935. And then after him was a man named Edvard Beneš. Important in the course of World War II, as we're going to see. So they had, throughout this whole period, quite stable political existence. Beneš, before becoming president, was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. They both represented Czechoslovakia at the Paris Peace Conference. They both signed the Pittsburgh Agreement, creating Czechoslovakia in the United States in May. By the way, it's useful to note that throughout Central Europe, and as you can see throughout Central Europe, you have all of these countries running from the Baltic countries, all came into being: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece. Greece was already in existence, as was Bulgaria, but nonetheless, most of these so-called successor states, those that came into being as a result of the breakup of the empires, began as parliamentary democracies. So most of them began as parliamentary democracies. But all of them, with one exception, by the 1930s, had become authoritarian dictatorships. The one exception was Czechoslovakia. Until the very end of the interwar period, it maintained a liberal democratic system characterized by a representative government and, most important, the rule of law. And that state, or that situation, was to have a very positive impact on the country's Carpatho-Rusyns. The large delegation from the Central Russian National Council, that is that one that met in May 1919, delegation traveled to Prague that same month after they finished their deliberations in Uzhorod to meet with President Masaryk and other officials of the new republic. And when they came there, they were filled with high hopes that their voluntary decision, this is pretty rare in politics, this is a voluntary decision to unite with Czechoslovakia, seemed to be the right one, made in the best interests of their people. One of the leaders at the Uzhorod Congress here in May, a figure whose name we will encounter aside from Dukhnovych, was another man named Avgustyn Voloshyn. And as part of the delegation, he then later recalled, as he said, Golden Prague solemnly greeted and sincerely cared for the Rusyns, and we returned home with hope for a better future. Well, as we shall see, such hope and faith in one sense was justified, but it was continually challenged. The challenges resulted from two issues: borders and political status. Borders and political status. This is kind of the story of interwar Subcarpathian Rus. And from the very outset, those two issues were to sour relations between Carpatho-Rusyns on the one hand and the central Czechoslovak government on the other. And also between Carpatho-Rusyns and Slovaks. That is the border issue, as we're going to see. As for those borders, quote unquote, the Treaty of Saint-Germain 1919 spoke of, quote, the territory of the Russian people, en français, le peuple ruthène, south of the Carpathians. Well, south of the Carpathians, so that means all of them living south of the Carpathians. And according to the Czechoslovak Constitution, the new Czechoslovak Constitution of February 1920, that territory was given an official name, called in Czech Podkarpatská Rus, or Subcarpathian Rus. The other issue concerned the implementation of autonomy, or self-government. Again, autonomy is not independence. It's self-government within a larger political structure. But autonomy was also guaranteed by that international treaty of Saint-Germain. So here are your two issues: borders and political status. Now, with regard to borders, territory, the original agreement reached already in the United States between the future President Masaryk and Carpatho-Rusyn immigrants, Scranton, Pennsylvania, the declaration of Carpatho-Rusyn unity with Czechoslovakia proclaimed in Uzhorod in May 1919. All of these documents spoke of 8 historic counties as comprising an autonomous Rusin state. And those 8 autonomous counties began in the Prešov region, actually began at the Poprad River. You all know where the Poprad River is, well into Slovakia, and stretched eastward. However, the boundaries weren't fixed in the beginning. Slovaks didn't like the idea that some of, quote unquote, their territory might be given to this autonomous province of Subcarpathian Rus, all within the same country. And so they fixed as a temporary boundary between Slovakia and Subcarpathian Rus the river Uzh. You know where the river Uzh is? It's blue here on your map, and it flows into Uzhorod. By the way, the Slovaks wanted Uzhorod as well, but they didn't get it. But finally, in 1928, when the Czechoslovak Republic was administratively reorganized into 4 provinces, now the boundary between Subcarpathian Rus and Slovakia was definitely fixed, and they just moved it to calm some discontent among Carpatho-Rusyns. They moved it a little bit farther west. So it's just a little bit farther west, and that's the boundary, which more or less, is the present-day boundary between Slovakia and Ukraine, or, if you will, the eastern end of the European Union. Now, both the Treaty of Saint-Germain and the Czechoslovak Constitution did specify that Subcarpathian Rus should have its own representative diet and its own governor. Again, very specifically an international treaty and in the Czechoslovak Constitution. But as it turned out, a diet was never convened during these interwar years. And while a governor was appointed by the Czechoslovak president, his executive authority was virtually non-existent. This is because the province's administration was, in fact, directed by the vice governor. And the vice governor was always a Czech. And he was appointed and responsible directly to the central government in Prague. Now, because of this conflict or disagreement over the provincial borders that we've just spoken about and over autonomy, or the lack thereof, the initial political honeymoon between Carpatho-Rusyns or Carpatho-Rusyn political activists and the Czechoslovak government that I just quoted through the words of Voloshyn, that honeymoon was over. Actually, in recognition of his contributions to the Czechoslovak cause, and the crucial contributions, our friend from Pittsburgh, Gregory Rzadkovich, was actually appointed by President Masaryk in May 1920, the first governor of Subcarpathian Rus. Now, how can an American citizen hold an office in a foreign country? Cannot. Against American law, and if you do, you lose your citizenship. With the exception of special dispensation from the president. And so, of course, Rzadkovich gets special dispensation from the president, and here we have this American citizen, governor of a territory in a foreign country. But his tenure lasted very briefly, from May 1920 to March 1921. Why? Because in March 1921, he resigned in protest. Over what? The border issue and autonomy, and returned to the United States, never to go back to Europe. What we have here is something somewhat similar. It seems that the Czechoslovak approach to politics was like that in the former Habsburg Empire. And what was the characteristic, for the most part, some exceptions like the Revolution of 1848, but for the most part, the characteristic of Habsburg politics was procrastination. We can probably talk about that being a characteristic of other regimes in other countries. Procrastination. The Czechoslovak variant of procrastination, well, the authorities in Prague argued that autonomy could not be implemented in Subcarpathian Rus because the local inhabitants were not yet mature enough to participate in a modern democratic political process. And also because many of the local leaders, especially the traditionally influential Greek Catholic clergy, either favored or expected a return of Hungarian rule. You know, a lot of people didn't think that Czechoslovakia was going to last. This is, you know, put together this new state, and so, okay, it's backed by the Allies, but how long is it going to last? Well, so many leaders in Subcarpathian Rus thought that it wasn't going to last long. And this was what the Czechoslovak government was concerned about. And so until a transitional, or if you will, educative period was completed, the authorities in Prague would have to rule the region directly. Of course, it was not clear how long this transitional period was to last. Now, one reason for the Czechoslovak government's reluctance to grant autonomy, I've alluded to it already, that is, within the province itself, there were some who felt that Hungarian rule would come back or should come back. And that was among the large presence of Hungarian or Magyar population living in the area. 192,000 inhabitants. Down here you can see this is still Subcarpathian Rus, but it's not green. And so this is really where the Hungarians lived and still live until this day, which leads to other kind of problems with the present Hungarian government and Ukrainian government. But their presence was considered by the Czechoslovak authorities a potential threat to the political stability of the region. And as I said, the Greek Catholic clergy, in particular during the early 1920s, included many pro-Hungarian priests and bishops, and then local Magyar politicians who were becoming increasingly susceptible to propaganda from neighboring Hungary, because neighboring Hungary was absolutely appalled by the Paris Peace Conference, the Treaty of Trianon, and another one of those palaces that was signed specifically with Hungary and took away 2/3 of its territory. And so within interwar Hungary, there was a revisionist movement, a desire to change the borders of the order that was created by the Paris Peace Conference. And that would then include Hungary getting back Subcarpathian Rus, and for that matter, all of Slovakia, which they just simply called Felvidék in Hungarian, which means the highlands. From their perspective, this was all Hungarian territory. And it was these irredentist threats which prompted Czechoslovakia to reassess the role of its Far Eastern province. Now, why do I say reassess? Well, it's interesting to note that Czech and Slovak political leaders active during World War I, and that included Masaryk and Beneš, those leaders, whether they were at home or like Masaryk and Beneš abroad, never expected to have Russian-inhabited lands included within their proposed state. There were maps that they issued. This is what we want our new state of Czechoslovakia to look like. Never went farther than Uzhorod, never. President Masaryk and his Minister of Foreign Affairs, Beneš, suggested that, well, okay, Czechoslovakia should take care of their Carpatho-Rusyn Slavic brethren. After all, they were fellow Slavs, fellow stateless Slavs like Czechs and Slovaks had been. But only until such time as the larger question of Russia and the larger question of all of the East Slavs would become stabilized. Remember, there was civil war going on there, war between Ukrainians and Poles. So sooner or later, when that gets stabilized, then Czechoslovakia would be most willing to give this territory to them, whomever, not clear. However, by the 1930s, Subcarpathian Rus itself took on a new and important geopolitical significance. Well, what do I mean by that? From the very outset, and continuing throughout the entire interwar period, Czechoslovakia was surrounded on almost all sides by enemies. Poland in the north, Hungary in the south, and Germany in the west. Austria not quite yet an enemy and not quite yet part of Germany. But the rest, yes. The first significant threat, as I've already said, was posed by Hungary, which felt a profound injustice was done to them by that Paris Peace Treaty signed at Trianon. And so border revisionism became the dominant slogan of interwar Hungarian foreign policy. And again, as I said, both Subcarpathian Rus and Slovakia were the primary objects. Get those territories back. And to protect itself from this Hungarian threat, certainly verbalized and possibly military, Czechoslovakia formed an alliance, so-called Little Entente. With whom? With the only countries in that region that were not opposed to Czechoslovakia, and that is Romania and Yugoslavia, who had their own concerns about Hungarian revisionism, because the Hungarians wanted Transylvania back from Romania, and they wanted the Vojvodina back from Yugoslavia. And so now it's created this Little Entente. And note that the only geographical link between Czechoslovakia and its new allies was Subcarpathian Rus. So now it takes on important geopolitical connotations. And so this province, with Czech and Slovak leaders, had never expected to obtain during the post-World War I repartitioning of Europe, now it became an important geopolitical cornerstone of its foreign policy. And so the international environment made it more imperative than ever that the central government in Prague keep a close hold on the administration in Subcarpathian Rus. All along, however, we should repeat that Czechoslovakia remained a democratic republic governed by the rule of law. Not only were all citizens, regardless of nationality or religion, treated equally, all of them could and were expected to participate in elections, whether at the local level, at the county level, at the federal level, the national level. Subcarpathian Rus itself, as a province, had a fixed number of representatives elected both to the House of Deputies and the Senate in the Czechoslovak parliament in Prague. Now, yes, there was discontent with autonomy not being unfulfilled, or unfulfilled autonomy. The border question, these were still issues that motivated discontent among Carpatho-Rusyns, in particular their activists. But popular discontent was really and primarily related to economic concerns. Small-scale subsistence farming and animal husbandry, just as they had been before in the Hungarian kingdom, remained the mainstay of the Subcarpathian economy. Industry, which consisted of a few chemical distilleries and lumber mills already from the pre-war Hungarian days, was not a priority for Czechoslovak government planners. The result was that the vast majority of the Carpatho-Rusyn population, and when I say the vast majority, 82% in 1930, in the middle of our period, remained engaged in agricultural or forest-related work. Whatever trade or small-scale industry that existed was almost always in the hands of local Hungarian and Jewish inhabitants. By the way, the Hungarians made up 15% of the population, Jews 13%. Or in the hands of Czechs, who began to arrive in increasing numbers from the western part of the country. Now, it is true that the Czechoslovak government did attempt to improve the economic status of the region. Actually, the central government invested much more than it extracted from the region in order to construct hydroelectric system, network of modern roads and bridges throughout the province. Many of them are still used today. Everyone kind of jokes after close to 40 years of Soviet rule and another 30 of independent Ukraine, the buildings that are the strongest and still stand are the ones that the Czechoslovaks built now close to 100 years ago during this interwar period. By the way, this province even got an airport. Uzhorod had got its own airport in 1929 with both domestic and international flights. So, infrastructure, Czechoslovakia invested a lot with concrete results. And in the rural countryside, they also promoted new means of cultivation. There was a land reform law breaking up the large estates of the Hungarian landowners. But despite all of this, by the late 1930s, as many as 70% of Carpatho-Rusyns still had less than 5 acres of land, which meant that they couldn't really sustain themselves, at best, on a subsistence level. And that meant that the need to find supplementary work was as acute as ever. But now there was another problem. One that was brought about by this geopolitical realignment after World War I of the entire Central European realm. We remember that before World War I, the difficult economic status of Subcarpathia's rural inhabitants was alleviated by the possibility for seasonal work on the fertile Hungarian plains or emigration abroad, most especially to the Northeast United States. But now, after World War I, the post-war circumstances of Czechoslovakia and the, in particular, new border with Hungary, an international border, and of course the relations between Hungary and Czechoslovakia are not that good, as we've just said. And so this now cut off the option of summer work nearby. And also, at the very same time, 1921, 1924, the United States passes restrictions on immigration, specifically setting up quota systems so that Central Europeans and Southern Europeans that had come en masse before the war could no longer emigrate to the United States. We didn't like these hunkies, these bohunks. Keep them out. They're ruining America. And so that eliminated the American safety valve for people who needed work. It is true that the western part of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia, Moravia, and Silesia, which is actually the present-day independent Czech Republic, had a thriving industrial sector. But those sectors were geographically too far away to make economically feasible to sell surplus wood and other products from Subcarpathian Rus. So all of these realities were made only worse by the world economic depression of the 1930s. Remember, the stock market crashed in 1929, and this affected the world, other than the Soviet Union. And as a result of now these dire economic situation, mortgage foreclosures, strikes, grain shortages, and in some villages, starvation had now, by the 1930s, become a common phenomenon. Displeasure, Carpatho-Rusyn displeasure with unfulfilled political promises, the worsening economic conditions, was translated, because this was a democratic state, you have elections, you have political parties, and that got translated into ongoing support for parties that were opposed to the government, and in particular the communists. Again, Czechoslovakia being a liberal democratic state, the Communist Party were eventually banned in every Central European state, except one, Czechoslovakia. And the Communist Party made inroads, in particular, into those areas that had serious economic problems, such as Subcarpathian Rus. And in 1935, as an example, the last parliamentary elections to take place in interwar Czechoslovakia, as high as 63% of the Subcarpathian electorate voted for parties opposed to the government. And so, despite the well-meaning efforts and extensive investments of the Czechoslovak government, Subcarpathian Rus was simply too far away and too underdeveloped for Prague to have been able to make any substantial economic improvements. And when I say too far away, get this. Always when people looked at interwar maps, you saw this kind of almost like a snake, right? This tall, long, thin country, Czechoslovakia. So, just note, this was the point of Czechoslovakia, a town called Cheb, or Ash, and then the last town in Subcarpathian Rus. The distance from here to here was farther than from here to London, England. Just to give you an idea. So it was really in the Far East of this narrow country. So we've looked at some of the negative things. Now let's look at some other things. And we should mention these. It was actually in the cultural sphere that the Czechoslovak regime made the most marked progress in Subcarpathian Rus. And in a sense, the contrast could not have been greater between the situation in pre-war Hungarian kingdom that ruled the area and now post-war or interwar Czechoslovakia. Perhaps under Czechoslovakia, the longest lasting changes occurred in the school system. Already during Czechoslovak rule, there was a dramatic increase in the actual number of schools. This expansion of the physical plant was accompanied by an increase in the student body, whose numbers actually doubled between 1920 at the beginning of our period and 1938 at the end. Changes in the language of instruction were even more dramatic. Remember, we spoke about Magyarization in the last years of Hungarian rule before World War I. And during those last years of Hungarian rule, there were only 34 bilingual elementary schools which provided at best only a few hours of instruction in the local Rusin spoken vernacular. So, for all intents and purposes, hardly any Rusin language schools. The Czechoslovak regime, however, made a concerted effort to offer some kind of instruction in an East Slavic language, whether that be Ukrainian or Russian or the local Rusin speech. And the result was that in 1920, there were already 300 such so-called Rusin schools. That's what they were called, regardless of what the language was. But clearly an East Slavic language was being taught, so there were 300 in 1920 in all categories, elementary, secondary, technical. And by 1938, that number rose to 500, so almost doubled. It was also during these interwar years that the first long-lasting cultural organizations that were designed to serve specifically Carpatho-Rusyns and be run by them came into being during interwar Czechoslovak rule. And the two of them that were the most important was something called the Prosvita Society, or Enlightenment, and the Dukhnovych Society. Prosvita means enlightenment. Dukhnovych is, of course, the name of the national awakener that you know about from the mid-19th century. The main instrument whereby these organizations carried their message was the village reading room. Remember, there were village reading rooms in Austrian Galicia, but there weren't any for Carpatho-Rusyns in the Hungarian kingdom. But now we have a lot of them. And the message of these village reading rooms, where Subcarpathian Rusyns could obtain newspapers and books and hear lectures, the message of these grassroots cultural organizations was clear, and I quote from one of the brochures: "In the reading rooms, our peasants must first of all be taught that they are Rusyns. The reading room must teach our peasant to love his mother tongue, in short, to love everything that is Rusin." By the year 1929, midpoint in the interwar years, the Dukhnovych Society had 192 of these reading rooms. The Prosvita Society had 92. So we're talking about close to 300 reading rooms. Aside from that, there were a whole host of authors, literary journals, scholarly journals, all in Rusin, being published, or one of the other East Slavic languages, for the first time. To wit as well, a wide range of theatrical, musical, sports activity that reached large numbers of people in both urban and rural areas. So much was achieved in the cultural realm, but it's not that the cultural sphere was without its problems. One concerned religion and the struggle between competing churches. We know that the Carpatho-Russyn world is Greek Catholic or Orthodox, primarily. And we saw how the Orthodox revival began slowly before World War I, and what the implications of that was under Hungary and under Austria-Hungary. And that was to ban orthodoxy among these people, put them on trial for treason. But in the new environment of a democratic Czechoslovakia, the traditional predominance of the Greek Catholic Church was now challenged, and very quickly challenged, by orthodoxy. The result was what some have described as kind of religious war, especially during the 1920s. So if, for instance, during the last years of wartime Austro-Hungarian rule, there may have been upwards of 5,000 Orthodox adherents, in Subcarpathian Rus, after a decade of Czechoslovak rule, there were 110,000. A number that represented at the time 20% of the Carpatho-Rusyn population in the province. So the Orthodox, which were a minority religion, now become a very important religion alongside the Greek Catholic Church. And for its part, the Greek Catholic Church, the Eparchy of Mukachevo, was obviously concerned with this rapid loss of its members. And one immediate result was religious conflict at the village level, where Greek Catholics and these newly converted Orthodox, sometimes members of the same family. So when the same family, one will be Orthodox, another will be Greek Catholic. So you can imagine what Sunday meals are like, which is actually repeated in the United States among these immigrants. But in practice in the villages, the first thing they were doing was struggling and clashing for control of the church building. I mean, if it's a Greek Catholic church, but now you have Orthodox, well, who does the church, who's the building belong to? And so this is really often what happened. If, for instance, the majority of inhabitants in a particular village proclaimed, they were Greek Catholic, but now they proclaimed that they were Orthodox, they would remove the Greek Catholic priest with his family and his personal belongings from the parish house, escort them to the end of the village, and then immediately invite an Orthodox priest to bless and administer their village church. And in those cases where the Orthodox were a minority, their efforts to take over the church were met by resistance from the Greek Catholic majority, leading to clashes, intervention by Czechoslovak police, arrests, and court cases between the claimants, Orthodox or Greek Catholic, for church property. I mean, the Czechs didn't get involved, but they had to keep order. And for them, these Eastern Rite churches, they all look the same anyway, so what's the problem? Well, problem. In part, this religious rivalry was related to the other challenging problem in interwar Czechoslovakia and a challenging problem among Carpatho-Rusyns almost always. And that is the question of national identity. Who are Carpatho-Rusyns? More often than not, those Carpatho-Rusyns who joined the Orthodox Church adopted a Russian national identity. This was in reaction to the Greek Catholic Church. Greek Catholic Church dominated by, at least initially, by pro-Hungarian elements until the 1930s when they changed, and then they supported the Russian national orientation. It was, in effect, this issue of national identity and the closely related language question which were the most problematic aspects of Subcarpathia's civic life. Now, these problems existed in the 19th century, as we saw, but they were overshadowed by state-imposed Magyarization and national assimilation. But now, under the Czechoslovak Republic, the local Slavic population and its leaders had the freedom to determine who they were. And then during these resulting debates, then we had emigres coming from the Russian Empire who promoted either a Russian national orientation or sometimes a Ukrainian one, emigres from Polish-ruled Galicia who were settled there promoting a Ukrainian orientation. And of course, we know, and very briefly, what are these three orientations? I use the term Russophile, Ukrainophile, Rusinophile. What this meant was that a person believed that they were Ukrainian, or believed that they were Russian, or believed that they were neither Russian or Ukrainian, but a distinct Carpatho-Rusyn nationality. And so you had these three orientations struggling against each other, propagated by a whole wide variety of newspapers, journals, literary works, each representing one of those orientations. School teachers express their inclinations toward one or the other of these orientations by using Russian, Ukrainian, or Russian. So you could go to a middle school or an elementary school, you walk into one class, teachers speaking Ukrainian, walk into another class speaking literary Russian, go into another class, they're speaking Russian dialect. So this conflict played itself out in the educational realm. This was the situation then in 1938, when Czechoslovakia entered a new stage in its political evolution. And that new stage was to have a profound impact on the national and cultural developments throughout Carpathian Rus, Subcarpathian Rus. But before we see that implication of 1938, we will look at similar developments in the Prešov region of Czechoslovakia and in the Lemko region of Poland during the interwar period next week.